So just to see where we're all at, if you were to tell someone about logical reasoning, what would you tell them? They're like stressing out on the metro. They got their LSAT book, and you're like, oh, I see you're stressing out about the LSAT. They're like, yeah, I really hate logical reasoning. What do you do? What do you tell them? Yeah?
I guess you could introduce like the general category of like questions. Like
You could do that. Is that what you would do? You'd say, hey, yeah, well, there's different categories.
Yeah.
You could recommend.
I don't know.
I would. I'll just be like, yeah, I have to think of all these different categories. And then,
What are the different categories?
you know, like things that are flaws.
There are flaw questions, yeah. But it doesn't sound like this is something that you're using on a daily basis because it's not something that's coming to your mind right away, right? Like when you show up on test day.
I have my, like, I don't remember the categories, but like I know like what I.
So what triggers, oh, this is what I do in this situation? Can you think of a specific thing?
Like if I'm reading the question, like what triggers how I know something.
I don't know. What advice would you give this person? Would you say, hey, look, there's categories. I don't really know them, but they're really helpful, and you should get to know them, and let me know when you find out about them.
Like I read the question, and then based off of that, I'm like, okay, what is it asking me? And then I'm like, oh, is it this type of question? And I think about that, and I'm like, what will it say?
Okay, so you maybe are familiar with the different types, but you're not necessarily sure of their names?
No, I know some of their names.
Oh, okay. Some of them.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Okay, well, this is a good start. Anything else? What else would we say?
You gotta sign up for strategy prep.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Will. Will's not a plant, I swear. In any case. Anything else? That would be great advice, by the way. I think it's probably the best advice. Yeah.
It's about picking like the best answer, so reading, like you would have to read through all the answer choices.
Okay, so when you're going through logical reasoning, the one thing that you're keeping in mind is I gotta pick the best of 5, not necessarily like the perfect answer or something? Is that what the advice you would want to give them?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't feel.
I don't know.
Okay, I know. I'm just trying to. Like, what would you tell these people? Yeah.
I would tell them to try to pick apart the argument.
Okay, pick apart the argument. That sounds good. That's a good start. It's very concrete, right? Okay. Yeah.
Inaccurate information is a deadly sin.
It's a deadly sin. They'd probably be like, whoa. Okay. Yes, true though. When you say pick apart the argument, like, can you elaborate on that? Like, if they're like, oh yeah, what do you mean?
Yeah, well, there's almost always a reason why the conclusion doesn't follow properly, so they try to figure out what that is, what's missing.
Okay, so what's implied there is you got to figure out what the conclusion is. You got to figure out what the evidence for that conclusion is, and that there's something wrong with the conclusion.
A lot of times.
Okay, all right. And how do you decide whether there's something wrong with it?
If there's a missing assumption that you're basing it on an unstated premise.
Okay. You're basing the conclusion on an unstated premise. In other words, the argument is assuming something, and therefore the conclusion is not necessarily proven. Yeah, okay. Good, I like this. Are all passages arguments? No? Okay, so when you read a passage, you're going to encounter one of two things, right? What are the two options? Yes?
An argument or a set of facts.
Argument or a set of facts. How many times out of 10 are you going to encounter a set of facts?
Once?
2?
Once or twice, right? So the vast majority of these things are arguments. And so when you're reading this passage, you just need to be first understanding it and then trying to decide, is this person making an argument to me or are they just telling me facts? Right? And if you do decide that they're making an argument, you want to figure out what the main conclusion is and whether or not that's proven. That's the name of the game. Now, there's kind of like a hierarchy, right? First skill is, can you identify whether it's an argument or not? That can be a challenge. Sometimes these are obviously arguments, sometimes it's not so obvious. Let's say that you identify that it's not an argument. You're like, okay, this person's just talking. And then it's like, which one found is true? Most strengthens the argument above. What do you do at that moment in time? Does that ever happen to anyone? Okay. Cool. I'm glad we have a couple honest people here. But that doesn't happen to you guys?
I'm sure it does.
You can't remember that ever happening? So every time it says which one of true most strengthens the argument, you're like, yes, I knew that was an argument.
I feel like generally I assume things are arguments because I know more likely than not they're going to be arguments.
Okay. Okay. So when you know it's an argument, you know that you know where the conclusion is? Alright. Cool. Well, anyways, be sensitive to when you identify something as a set of facts versus an argument. If you identify it as a set of facts and then you read that they're asking you to strengthen the argument or weaken the argument or find a flaw in the reasoning or find a necessary assumption or a sufficient assumption or a parallel reasoning or a parallel flaw, those are all question types that require the original passage to be an argument, not just a set of facts. Right? So, your first skill is, can you identify whether it's an argument or a set of facts? Once you've identified that it's an argument, your next skill is to decide whether or not it's good or bad, whether or not the premises prove the conclusion. And I would say a lot of people get to a point where they can confidently say, yes, that argument is flawed, but they can't articulate why. So they're like, yeah, I don't like that conclusion. That conclusion is not proven. And it's like, okay, cool. Why? And they're like, because it's bad. Okay, great. Because the evidence doesn't support the conclusion. Yes, 100%. That's what makes it invalid. So why do you think it's invalid? Well, because it's flawed. Right? Like, you just keep saying that it's bad, but you don't get into why it's bad. And that's probably the hardest thing. Like going from, okay, have I identified it as an argument, to is it bad, to then why it's bad, that is the hardest thing. Now, you have to just keep practicing and trying to identify why it's bad, right? Now, on some occasions, you're just like, I can't identify why it's bad, but I know it's bad, and then you go looking at the answers, and one of the answers sticks out, and you're like, yes, that's what I was thinking, I just couldn't really articulate it, right? But notice that's a little bit more passive way of taking the test, because what you're doing is you're waiting for them to throw stuff in front of you, and you say, okay, yes, that looks like what I'm looking for, as opposed to getting to a point where for most, not all, but most of these questions, you're saying, okay, I see your conclusion. You can't conclude that because you can't go from part to whole, or you can't go from correlation to causation, or whatever it is. If you can do that, then you're going to move faster eventually. It's harder. So when you're drilling and you have all the time in the world, just sit there and try to identify why you think that argument is flawed. If you didn't think it was flawed, but then you saw that you were looking at a weakened question, strengthened question, flaw question, necessary assumption question, sufficient assumption question, or a parallel flaw question, you know that it has to be flawed. Because there's no way to strengthen a valid argument, there's no way to weaken a valid argument. If the argument is perfect, if it's legit, if the premises do in fact prove the conclusion, then there are no assumptions, etc. Right? So, in any case, as you drill, practice that. Now, when it's not an argument, when it's just a set of facts, I would try to figure out what must be true on the basis of them. Now, sometimes it's very obvious because they say, hey, if A, then B, and then they say if B, then C. So then you would conclude if A, then C, right? But sometimes it's not so obvious. At the very minimum in those cases, at least try to understand clearly in your mind what each sentence is saying. Okay. All right. Let's categorize a few more things. So in addition to arguments versus facts, there are a few question types that fall into the top-down and the bottom-up categories. Now, I know I use that analogy a lot, and if you never caught it, you're probably annoyed every time I say it, because you're like, I don't know what that means. So, great, that question's top-down. Sweet, it's top-down. What does that even mean? Does anyone know what that means? Okay, yeah.
Does it mean you get your answer from like looking at the passage rather than like bottom where you would get it from the options it gives you.
I think you're on the right path, but we want to clarify a little bit more because in all cases you gotta look at the
So like
passage,
you're
right?
using the passage to prove the answers
Yes.
rather than like the answers to prove the passage.
That's exactly right. So in a top-down question, you're assuming that everything in the passage is true and you're using that to prove one of the answers. Whereas in a bottom-up question, you're assuming that the 5 answer choices are true and you're using them to do something to the passage. Can anyone give me an example of a bottom-up question? Question type. Doesn't matter, anyone out there. For example, strength questions. What do you guys think about those? What's that?
Bottom
Is
up.
that bottom up or top down?
Uh,
Okay, it's bottom up. Why is it bottom up?
Because you're using information from the answer choices to improve the argument in front of you.
That's exactly right. So strengthen is a bottom up question. Alright? Can anyone give me examples of... Okay, I'll just throw them out there. You tell me what you think they are. How about this? Necessary assumption.
Top down.
Okay, why is it top down?
Because you are looking at the passage and trying to figure out what's the unstated premise,
What?
which is going to be in the answers.
And not only it's an unstated premise, but it's an unstated premise that is required. Right? So you're asking yourself, does this have to be assumed? Not if it were assumed, what would happen? Okay? How about sufficient assumption?
Top down.
Okay, why?
Has to be assumed for the argument to be valid, same reason.
Has to be assumed is necessary assumption. Which one of the following, if assumed,
Okay.
enables the conclusion to be properly drawn,
Bottom
is
up,
a
yeah.
sufficient assumption, and that's bottom up. Okay? How about a weakened question?
Top down.
Okay, why do you say it's top down?
Because you're assuming the argument is true, but the options are like weakening it.
The options are weakening it, but the way the question is phrased is which one of the following, if true, most weakens the reasoning above. So it's actually a bottom-up question because you're assuming that the 5 answer choices are true, and you're saying which one does the most to weaken it. Okay, how about a flaw question? Flaw question is phrased like, the argument is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that it...
Top down.
Top down, why do you say top down?
Because you're finding like what's wrong with the argument. You're like using the facts presented to prove what's the right answer.
Yeah, so the 5 answer choices are descriptions of what's wrong with the argument. So you're not saying if this is true, you're saying does this describe what's wrong? Yes, this does, or no, this doesn't. Right? So it's a top-down question. How about role questions? You guys know what role questions are? Which one follow the role of the second sentence, or the second sentence plays which one of the following roles in the argument? That's also top down. How's it going back there?
I said neither.
Neither.
Yeah.
It doesn't apply.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a good guess actually. We gotta buck the trend every now and then. Role questions are top down because just like flaw questions, you're describing the role that thing plays in the argument. So it's like, does this describe that? Okay? Does it have to be true? You could really ask yourself that. And if it doesn't have to be true, it's wrong. Okay? Reasoning questions. Which one of the following best describes the reasoning employed by the author above?
Top down.
That's also top down. Okay? Must be true questions. Which one of the following must be true? Okay, that's also top down, so must be true. Okay? What else do we got? Oh, paradox questions. Which one of the following, if true, most helps to explain the apparent discrepancy described above? That's bottom up because it's saying which one of the following, if true, right? So this is paradox questions. Let's write it out. Paradox. Okay? Now, you don't need to memorize all these things necessarily, but you do want to get a sense of, okay, when they're asking me to do something, are they asking me to assume that the answer choices are true and then do something with them, or are they asking me essentially which one of the answer choices has to be true? I mean, we have a question type that asks explicitly which one of the following answers must be true. But these are all variants of must be true. Like when they ask you what's a necessary assumption in the argument, they're essentially asking you which one of the following has to be true, which one of the following has to be assumed. Yeah.
Do the parallel questions fit into this?
Oh, that's a very good question. So parallel questions are top down because you're looking at the passage and you're saying, okay, which one matches that? You can't be like, well, if this were true, would it affect that in some way? Right? You're just taking that and you're saying, does this match? Does this match? And so you're using that to prove one of the answer choices. So you have parallel reasoning and parallel flaw. Okay. Well, and notice this is just a type of reasoning question. It's a flaw question. We have flaw and reasoning. So there's a lot of different question types. I don't want to confuse you with those so much. But one thing that's interesting is that in bottom-up questions, lo and behold, what tends to be true about the correct answer? Stronger language, right? Because what you're doing is you're saying which one, if it were true, would most weaken, most strengthen, prove the conclusion, or most help to resolve the paradox. Which one's going to do the most to help us out here, right? And it's sad when people are like, oh, I didn't like this answer in this sufficient assumption question because it seems too extreme. Well, that's not a reason to get rid of it. On the flip side of that, if you're looking at a must be true question or a necessary assumption question, these question types are asking what must be true, and so an extreme answer could be the very reason that it's wrong. This is one big issue I have with like Kaplan because they just say, watch out for extreme language, period. Like, welcome to our class. Watch out for extreme language. It's like, okay, what does that mean? Well, in this case, words like always or never or only are not necessarily wrong, but they're more likely to be wrong because you're like, does it really have to be assumed that only frogs swim in the lagoon? That's a question, by the way. Maybe not. No, maybe it does, and that's correct, but it's less likely to be the case. Whereas over here, saying only frogs swim in the lagoon could be a very good thing. That could really strengthen your argument or weaken your argument depending on what you're trying to do, right? So, yeah, you want to know what type of question you're in. Okay, any questions about any of this? Now there are 3 question types up here that are unusual in the sense that they are descriptions. So flaw, role, and reasoning. All those give you descriptions. Flaws, questions ask you to describe what's wrong with the argument. Reasoning questions ask you to describe the reasoning that the author used to get to her conclusion. Role questions ask you the role that a particular claim plays in the passage. Now, pop quiz for you guys. Do you remember the 5 different roles that a claim can play in an argument? A concession, opinion of others, premise, conclusion, intermediate conclusion. Right? Now, if you want to keep that simple, you're like, oh, that's too much to remember. Just remember that most claims are either premises or conclusions or something else. So if you're looking at a role question and they ask you, hey, what role does the second sentence play in the argument? Just try to figure out whether it's a conclusion or a premise. And if it's neither one of those, then it's something else. Right? That's good enough. That's good enough to get you going and get into the answer choices and find something that matches. But remember, it's a top-down question, so you're asking, does this describe exactly what role that played in the argument? If there's anything that's wrong, then that's out. By the way, this is where the inaccuracy is the greatest sin, right? Sorry to get all religious here, but this is my life. So that's going to matter a lot in these sort of must-be-true questions. In these questions, what tends to be true about the correct answer? They tend to bring in new information. You're saying which one following is true? Not that it has to be true, but if it were, would do the most to weaken, strengthen, or explain the paradox. It's not surprising to find new information here. Alright, bottom line, make sure you read and understand the passage. Once you've read it, decide whether it's an argument or a set of facts. If it's an argument, try to decide whether you think the conclusion is proven or not. And final skill, if you can do it, is to decide why you think it's proven or not proven. Sound good? Now, if that sounds overwhelming, keep in mind that you're already getting better at it given all the stuff that you've done. Right? On the easier arguments, you're probably already doing all of these things. You read a simple argument and it's flawed and you're like, wait, what about the other children in the study? If you're doing that, if you're asking yourself things like, yeah, but what about this other group? Or, yeah, what about crayons that don't work? Or something like that, right? If you're asking those kinds of questions, then that means you're reading the argument, you're reading the conclusion, and you're thinking of reasons why the conclusion is not necessarily true. That's all you have to do. Now remember, on the LSAT, what do you have to accept as true?
Whatever the argument states.
Whatever the argument states. So the whole thing?
No, like the facts of the argument
The
itself.
facts of the argument? Which are called what?
The premises.
The premises. How about intermediate conclusions? Are they premises?
Yes.
Wait, are we looking at our neighbor? So are intermediate conclusions premises? Yes?
Yes.
Yes. I guess.
No? Who says no? So do you have to accept them as true? How many people say yes? How many people say no? Okay, I know this is not very many voting. Not many people are voting here. So yeah, when it comes to a premise, you have a premise, right? And a premise could be used to support an intermediate conclusion, and then the intermediate conclusion could be used to support the main conclusion. That's a very basic argument right here. Well, if someone gives you a claim as a premise, they just assert it as true. They're like, the world is flat. Your gut would be like, no, it's not, dude. But if it's a premise on the LSAT, you just have to accept it as true. And then they conclude from that therefore you will fall off if you get to the edge. Sound good? That is an intermediate conclusion. And then they say, therefore, what would they say next? Any guess?
You will be dead.
You will be dead. Well, they could say, oh, that's interesting. I was thinking, don't go close to the edge, but yeah, sure. Okay, so then they said the world is flat, therefore you will, fall off, and therefore you will die. Thank you, class. This is a premise because it's being used to support this conclusion.
Right.
But it's also a conclusion because it's being used, or it's being supported by the first premise, right? You have to accept premises as true, but you don't have to accept any intermediate conclusions as true because the author tried to convince you of their truthfulness by using reasoning. Right? Anytime someone tries to convince you of something, you only have to accept it if they succeeded. Yeah.
Would it be just considered a stated assumption, like an intermediate conclusion?
No. I mean, an assumption by definition is unstated, so it's an intermediate conclusion, and we consider it a premise because it's used as evidence for something else. But it's not LSAT doesn't really have a term for this, but I guess I would just say it's not a pure premise. And we'll just call it pure premise. Sound good? This is a pure premise. You have to accept pure premises as true. You don't have to accept intermediate conclusions as true. That said, when you evaluate the argument, what you want to do is you want to ask yourself, was there any jump in reasoning going from here to here, and then was there any jump in reasoning going from here to here? So the way to evaluate this is ask yourself, well, if the world is flat, does that necessarily mean that you'll fall off when you get to the edge?
No, there could be ice wall there.
There could be an ice wall there.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's true. Or you could just like kind of like flip over to the other side, like, whoop, you know? I don't know. I've never experienced it. But this does not necessarily follow. Now, when you evaluate the conclusion, you don't have a bunch of anger about this, right? That's not anger. This is anger. You don't have a bunch of anger about this. You accept this as true. You say, okay, let me just, for the sake of argument, assume that you will fall off. If you fall off, does that mean that you're going to die? No, you might have a suit on. Spacesuit, right? So, when you're evaluating, sometimes people make the mistake of, they say, oh, I really hate, this does not follow. And then I'm like, is there any other problems? They're like, yeah, there's another problem. And they're like, this doesn't follow because who knows, you might not ever even fall off. Well, what you're doing is you're actually just going back to your original flaw, right? To evaluate each separate flaw, you have to say, okay, there's a flaw going from here to here, but now let's assume that we got here. Can I get from here to here? And if you can, then there's no flaw there, right? Okay. Anyways, that's that. We've talked about role. We've talked about reasoning. Must be true. All these, you're going to look for weaker language in the correct answer. Here, most likely stronger language, although that's secondary. What's interesting about the test, if you want to just step back even a little bit further, is that the one skill that it's testing is, can you figure out what must be true given what was said? That is the one skill that is universal everywhere. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're looking at a weakening question, right? Well, in a weakening question, you're going to have an argument. The argument is going to have premises and a conclusion. How do you decide whether an argument's conclusion is valid or invalid? You take the premises, let's say there's two of them, and you ask yourself, if those premises are true, what must be true? And then you compare that to whatever the author concluded. Right? Because there is something that must be true on the basis of those premises, and in a weakening question, it's going to be at least slightly different from what the author actually concluded. So at the end of the day, what you have to get good at is deciding what must be true given what was said. If you can do that, then you can do weakening questions, you can do must be true questions, you can do flaw questions, they're all the same. You're just trying to say, okay, well, this is what you said, and this is what you should have concluded. This is what would be something that must be true, but you said something else, and that's what's wrong. And the weird thing about that is that that's exactly what's happening in games, right? They give you a bunch of rules, and they say, hey, what must be true because of these rules? And then they ask the variance of that, what could be true, what couldn't be true. But you have to figure out what must be true to figure out what could be true. Right? Like, well, that could be true because this other thing doesn't have to be true. And reading comp is just read a bunch of stuff and tell me what must be true given what they said. So, at the end of the day, that's why it's so important to understand each individual sentence, because if you know exactly what that sentence is saying, then you can decide what could be concluded from that safely and what couldn't be. And that's it. So a lot of times as I'm reading these arguments, I'll read the first sentence, I'll then try to understand it. Then I'll read the second sentence and I'll be like, okay, well, if you said those two things, then this other thing must be true. So before I even read the conclusion sometimes, it's like I'm thinking X, then they conclude Y, and I say, oh, that's flawed. Right? Whereas sometimes I think we're reading these arguments and then going back and analyzing them. You can just be doing it as you go. Like, well, if this is what you're going to say to me, this is what you should have concluded, but this is what you actually concluded. Now, some of these arguments start with the conclusion first. So you might read a conclusion and say, oh, okay, is that what you're trying to prove to me? Why? Give me some evidence for it. And then they start giving you the evidence. You're like, this isn't enough. You should have said more, because all this proves is Y, but you're concluding X. Okay. All right, should we do some?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.